Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this session, which is going to be on RCAF Servicewomen. A slight change to the running order. We're going to do Sarah last because her presentation will be visual. So we'll start off with Karen, and she's going to talk to us on women in the RCAF Unification to the 21st century. So Karen, 20 minutes, floor is yours. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I definitely would like to start out by thanking the organizers for inviting me here. When I first received the invitation, I really wasn't sure if I was the right person. I have never worn an Air Force uniform, and I'm not formally trained as a historian. But I did spend 5 of my 22 years in uniform on air wings, or what we used to call bases at the time when I was on them. And my last 2 years in uniform, I spent as the social policy officer for the air staff in Ottawa. So I dealt a lot with gender integration and those sorts of issues. And throughout my time in the CAF, which was 1978 to 2000, I had many questions about the limitations that have been placed on my career, and I really didn't understand the full picture. So I've spent the last really 35 years, my last years as a personnel selection officer in uniform, followed by 22 years as a defense scientist with National Defense, and put considerable effort into investigating and conducting analysis of the CAF journey, Canadian Armed Forces journey, to negotiate gender. And that's how I capture it. It's how they negotiated sex and gender, actually. So this is, I'll be running through this story today. These are the key milestones of both opportunity and resistance. It takes us from 1967, when the Royal Commission on the Status of Women was established, and of course their recommendations in 1970, which coincided with unification as well. And then leading to the 1989 Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, which many are probably familiar, directed the full integration of women into all environments and roles. So a lot of my work has been from a full Canadian Armed Forces perspective, but today I'm going to try to pull out some of the highlights of the RCAF perspective as we went through this journey, and also to highlight some of the leadership roles of women in the RCAF throughout this journey. So we start out with the Royal Commission and Unification, as I'd mentioned. So in 1967, the RCSW was established, and of course the recommendations in 1970. From unification until 1971, women were restricted to a small number of occupations, predominantly those that provided support to medical, administrative, logistics, and communication systems. Unification did bring wider employment opportunities for women who had been serving in the RCAF prior to unification. They could now serve in Army and Navy units. However, it also came with some limitations for them. So, for example, prior to unification, they were able to serve in some of the squadrons that now, after the 1971 Defense Council Review, they were restricted from serving in because they were considered near combat or combat. So it was a bit of win and a bit of a step back, actually, for women in the Air Force. So throughout this whole journey, there was the Director of Women Personnel played a key role as an advisor to senior leadership at each step of the way. The Director of Women Personnel was always a female officer, and she took her direction from senior leadership in the CF. What's interesting here is because of the representation of women in the RCAF prior to unification, most, if not all of the officers who served as DWP were Air Force officers. So they had a key leadership role just through their filling those positions. So the DWP was first established as the advisor of women personnel in 1969. At the rank of major, AWP advised senior leadership on matters affecting servicewomen. The position was upgraded to Lieutenant Colonel in 1971 and became DWP, actually a director position, in 1972. DWP would monitor and advise on issues related to training, accommodation, welfare, morale, dress regulations and clothing, discipline, terms of service, and importantly, the employment of military women. The DWP, along with nursing officers, was also among those women who held the highest ranks in the CF throughout the 1970s. And the DWPs were typically personnel administration officers or nurses who held those roles. In 1974, the rank of the position was raised to colonel. And so this change was pretty significant because it increased the relative power, influence, and authority of the DWP. However, when resistance toward the expansion of women's roles was mounting in the 1980s in particular, the DWP was still at a disadvantage as there were senior officers around the table, typically brigadier generals and above, who were actually making the decisions on women's employment. Yet it still was important because DWP meant that women had a seat at the table, at the decision-making table, even if they weren't ultimately making the decision. So they had an insider role, so to speak. So DWP became somewhat of an internal voice for women in the military. And by the 1970s, the DWP was the only line of defense and advocacy for the status of women, and they were ready to move on in many ways, although it's not clear how many of them actually believed of women in the role of combat at that point yet, but certainly removing a lot of all of the other restrictions. So we believe that the concept of women freeing men for combat duty is outdated. A servicewoman's mission is to make available to the Canadian Forces the special skills and abilities she possesses. The CF is a team of professionally dedicated men and women, all of whom perform a necessary function. For the women in the Canadian Forces, equal opportunity means equal commitment. And this is important because the commitment and motivation of women to serve was always in question. Regardless of some of the progress that was being seen, the late retired Brigadier General Sheila Hellstrom, she recalled that when she was the DWP in 1975 and 1976, it seemed like quote unquote trench warfare. She and a few others struggled trade by trade to convince senior leadership to open up greater gender roles for women. If the DWP had their way, they would have just removed all the restrictions. They didn't make sense. So as the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal was coming into effect in 1978, NDHQ was getting a bit nervous about what it was saying about the employment of women, and they conducted a study. The Air Force, each of the environments responded to the study, and the Air Force response noted that a conscious attempt has been made to strip our argument of prejudice. Commander Air Command believes that women are capable of qualifying as Canadian Forces aircrew. But that really wasn't the problem for the Air Force, and this became a theme throughout the 80s for the entire CAF. It's easy to conclude that morale and effectiveness implications of women in combat are just not acceptable to Americans, nor should they be to us. I also have to conclude that we are unable to absorb even a limited number of women into pilot and other aircrew classifications. So this led up, of course, to the SWINTER trial, Servicewomen in Non-Traditional Environments and Roles. I know my co-panelist is going to talk in much depth about that, but this was a significant period when the chief of the defense staff at the time, Admiral Falls, established the SWINTER trials in 1979, actually. His goal was to negotiate the terms of bona fide occupational requirements in the Canadian Armed Forces and as stipulated in the Canadian Human Rights Act. BFORs, as we came to know them within the department, within the CAF, we just talked about them a lot throughout the 80s and 90s. He wanted to ensure that the CF maintained control of the employment of women. He noted that the term bona fide occupational requirement, as stated in the Act, was undefined but could be very restrictive in meaning. So, according to Admiral Falls, attempts to maintain all or a majority of the present departmental restrictions to the equal employment of women could force the Canadian Forces into a series of test cases before Canadian Human Rights Tribunals. This could excite high-profile, counterproductive media coverage. Loss of such test cases or avoidance of them through capitulation would cause the Canadian Forces to place individual women in environments where the probability of success could be needlessly prejudiced, and where their sudden appearance among unprepared men could arouse tensions, leading to unnecessarily early release of those involved. The resulting internal and public controversy would work against the collectives or the objectives of equal opportunity and national security and could delay optimum use of both male and female capabilities. So it sounded sensible, sounded like it made sense, but when you talk to the women who are actually involved, they felt that the intentions weren't quite that positive. After all, it was a trial. So during the SWINTER trials, RCAF officer, Lieutenant Colonel retired Shirley Robinson, and now passed as well, was deputy DWP, along with the now DWP, who had been a deputy DWP in 75-76, then Colonel Hellstrom. Lieutenant Colonel Robinson recalls the many committee meetings that they attended with little evident progress. So now we're into the early 80s, same situation as 75-76, meetings, talk, meetings, but really not a lot of progress. So she was pretty frustrated about this whole situation, and it contributed to her decision to leave the CF in 1984. And this will play out in another way very quickly. As the SWINTER trials were coming to conclusion, most will remember that, in 1985, a parliamentary committee on equality was established to examine the implications of Section 15 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Soon after the committee was announced, Lieutenant Colonel Robinson, now retired Lieutenant Colonel Robinson, received a phone call from a woman colleague still working in uniform, still in uniform in defense. And she said, the CF is going to be presented to the committee, this parliamentary committee, but we don't think they're going to represent serving women very well. Would you be able to present to that committee? So Lieutenant Colonel Robinson, now retired from the CAF, made a presentation to that committee. And she was able to find out every point that the CAF leadership was going to make and countered every single point in her presentation to the committee. So this was, a really good example of the leadership from inside the organization transferring to the outside and being very sort of innovative and figuring out how to affect this journey. So by the time the presentation was made, also Lieutenant Colonel retired Robinson, along with her co-founders, Maud Barlow, who then was the national chairperson for the Council of Canadians, and retired Canadian Forces officers Adele Carmus and Suzanne Simpson, were in the last stages of establishing what would become the Association for Women's Equity in the Canadian Forces. And this external organization also, throughout the 80s and 90s, was very active in promoting the interests of women in the CAF from outside the organization. So after the hearings across Canada for the Parliamentary Committee, the first report, Equality for All, did recommend that all trades and classifications in the Canadian Forces be open to women. The committee further signaled its lack of confidence in the Canadian military to self-regulate processes related to the equitable treatment of women. And I think this concept of self-regulation intersects with quite a few other topics and themes within defense. It recommended, because it was not confident with the CF, it recommended that the Canadian Human Rights Commission monitor the situation related to the employment and promotion to women. So that report went into another the final parliamentary report entitled Toward Equality. Toward Equality stated that the commitment to expanding the roles of women in all occupations would continue. However, the military would not be directly monitored and moving toward the objectives of integration. But the military wasn't out of the woods yet. They knew that they were still being watched quite closely. So in response to the parliamentary report, the military stood up the Charter Task Force on Equality. So the Charter Task Force considered several factors that they believed impacted the participation of women in the military beyond their current roles. You see these on the left. None of them are surprising. These were topics that had come up in different meetings and different forums over the last few years. But what was interesting, you see on the right-hand side, they also came up with a list of primary considerations, which actually took the argument outside of the Canadian Human Rights Act and the bona fide occupational requirements. So they maintained, first of all, that there was insufficient empirical evidence demonstrating that women would not undermine combat effectiveness, and that it was not possible to test such change under conditions of war in times of peace. So that was the first one. So as training for war takes place in peacetime, it is reasonable to place limitations on peacetime structure, as it is essential to ensure wartime preparedness of the Canadian military. So their reasonableness argument. Consequences of error, the task argued, were too great to risk. At worst, national security would be jeopardized, and casualties could be much heavier than otherwise would have been the case. And their final point, the task force argued that the rights and freedoms represented in Section 15 of the Charter applies to all Canadians. So according rights and freedoms to some Canadians while putting the rights and freedoms of others who have committed to the obligations of military service and whose service is essential to operational effectiveness, they would be put at risk. Therefore, they suggested limitations on the rights and freedoms of some, that is, at this point, women and 2S LGBTQ individuals were justified in their mind. So as we're coming out of the Charter Task Force, they don't recommend that the RCAF have any occupations closed, but they do recommend that 34 units not be open to women, and this included 16 units altogether, maritime helicopter squadrons, tactical helicopter squadrons, fighter squadrons, and the training units associated with those squadrons. So as they went into the combat-related employment of women, and I'll have to move quickly, I'm definitely running out of time. The Air Force did have concerns. Even though women were currently restricted from some roles, the Air Force didn't believe that sufficient numbers of women could be made available. They really wanted to avoid any affirmative action type of activity, and they thought that that might create undue pressure for some of the units as well as the women that might get put into those units. And as fighter pilots, they definitely did not want to have women as fighter pilots because it would disrupt cohesion, morale, trust, and confidence among pilots. And they were also concerned about maternity replacements and early attrition. However, they successfully made the argument with NDHQ to not participate in the SWINTER trials. So it meant that they didn't have to go out and recruit. So just a couple of interesting points. Towards the end, we come to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. Tribunal recommends full integration of women over the next 10 years. Interestingly enough, one of the complainants to the tribunal was a fighter pilot. He initially complained that men were subjected to put in at an unfair advantage because they had to go into harm's way and women didn't. By 1986, he clarified his complaint and actually started to seek an order that female fighter pilots be allowed to fly in combat, and that the CAF set up an affirmative action program. And so he became a friend of the Association for Women's Equity in the Canadian Forces. So we see this network developing. And so he's come from a bit of a lark type of complaint to actually understanding why women should be included in these roles. And so until at least 2003, he was writing letters on an annual basis to the minister, the CDS, the air staff. I had to answer his letter a couple times when I was on the air staff and give him an update on the status of women pilots. So we do see there was progress. The CHRC did monitor 4 occupations: air navigator, pilot, airborne electronic sensor operator, and flight engineer. Interestingly, pilots, it says that they were serving before 1988, and that goes back to General Clay, Wendy Clay, when she was an aeromedical officer, and she actually got her wings in 1972. And so then we quickly go forward to 2021. We can see that there's been a lot of progress. I just want to highlight very quickly a couple of things here. So pilot has almost doubled in numbers and proportion from 2.3% in 1987 to now 8.3%. But that's still only 106 pilots. They're still not well represented. NCMs are quite a challenge, still only represented at 5.5% across the air operations. and air technical NCMs only at 6.5% of the CAF, or sorry, that's the reserve side. But still they're quite low, the technical NCMs, 8.7%, and the air ops, 9%. All the occupations in the CAF are sitting at about 16%, and that of course includes anyone who wears an Air Force uniform, which is really important, not just the air crew and operational side of the house. I'm going to have to skip this. I won't dwell on it, but I wanted to mention that today my focus has not been on those women who were the first serving in previously all-male occupations and units. I recognize that they certainly were indeed leaders, but they're covered relatively more than what I've tried to cover today. They had to be leaders to be successful in blazing a trail for others, and I've had the privilege of knowing and being inspired by many of them, and these quotes come from a volume on women in leadership that was published in 2007. Major Forge is one of the ones that quite impressed me. And another one that wrote in that book was now Major General, then Major Jamie Spicer Blanchette, and that's a good chapter as well. So many inspiring leaders. And my last slide. So RCAF women leading in the Canadian Armed Forces. These aren't first for women in the RCAF. These are first for women in the CAF. And my closing point is that, you know, women serving in the RCAF have certainly been at the front end of leading change for the CAF in general. And in closing, I'd like to draw on a comment that was made by Rob Hubert in the opening comments of the conference when he pointed out that Canada is an air power. And so right away, and I don't think I need to convince anyone in this room, women in so many ways are indispensable contributors to that air power. And I think the last several decades of our history have definitely proven that, and they need to be part of the future. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Erin Gregory. I am the curator at the Canada Aviation and Space Museum. So I'm the current steward of a large collection of aircraft, over 130 of them. Most of them, about 65, 70%, are RCAF. So that's how I come into this. I'm not a military historian. I'll preface by saying that. I'm definitely a social historian, and that's sort of the lens that I bring to a lot of my work at the museum. So Karen has generously set the stage for a lot of what I was going to talk about, so I don't actually have to go into the nitty-gritty of some of the stuff, which is great, because then we can do more of the story. So the SWINTER trials begins in 1979. The Chief of Defense Staff makes an announcement to all Canadian Forces members saying that a controlled number of servicewomen selected from within the forces will be posted on a trial basis to a select number of non-combat units on the land environment, one or more non-combatant ships. In addition, a few women also selected from within the forces will undergo aircrew training. So I'll just give you a little post of basically where these women are in the 4 trials. Obviously, I'll be focusing on the aircrew trial pretty exclusively. So the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, this is important for the 6 recommendations that they make that are directed at the CAF specifically. It takes them a very long time to implement all of these recommendations. All of the changes are kind of slow, very incremental, and seemingly deliberate. The Canadian Human Rights Act, as Karen has talked about, here are the kind of 11 grounds that the Act is intended to protect people from discrimination, especially in employment, sex being one of them. So this becomes very important for the CAF because they have, as Karen noted, are getting very nervous about how many women they're going to have to allow into certain places where women have never been allowed before. Their primary objections and concerns were that women were expensive to train and employ, women do not remain in the forces as long as men, and that integration into all-male units could cause problems, negative sociological effects, unit cohesion and morale disruptions. They would undermine operational effectiveness and undermine perceived effectiveness. So that last bit is a bit interesting because, of course, other air forces and militaries across their alliances are also exploring what it means to invite women into these previously all-male spaces. The research objectives for the SWINTER trials were also kind of interesting. These objectives and the instructions for the trial continue to change even 3 and 3.5 years into the trial. So lots of times it sort of looks like they don't even necessarily know what they're looking for other than that they want the final answer to be no. That's kind of what you get at. No matter which way you shake it, that's what they're looking for. So where are we here? Okay, so in essence, the trials aim to compare not only the job performance of women to men, but the effectiveness of mixed-gendered groups, the resource implications of integrating servicewomen into these roles, and the sociological effects of women on unit cohesion, servicemen, and military families. So one of the things that they were required to report on were how spouses felt about women serving with their husbands. So they're, again, looking for any reason that they can possibly grasp to shut this down. So the bona fide requirements, this sort of changes in November 1979 as they're going through these instructions. They add this really interesting bit of text that says, the Department of National Defense continues to exclude women from service in primary combat roles, some remote locations, from duty at sea or as members of aircrew on the premise that bona fide occupational requirements exist, inhibiting the universal employment of servicewomen in the Canadian Forces. So in previous drafts of these instructions, that little bit of text doesn't exist. And yet again, that kind of reinforces the idea that the trials were really intended to prove a foregone conclusion. So the trial itself kind of begins with flawed methodology. So they talk a lot about the need for unimpeachable data and flawless methods in this trial, because they're anticipating that at the end, their answer will be no, and that they'll have to justify why this answer is no in front of the Human Rights Commission, basically. So despite that, they kind of set themselves up in such a way that the numbers of the trial, they know that statistically these numbers are going to be insignificant. So no matter what they do when they go in front of this tribunal, they're not going to have the numbers to really fully justify why they're making these exclusions. The methods themselves rely on subjective input in the form of questionnaires, interviews, reports. They are being administered by CF Peru, the Canadian Forces Personnel Applied Research Unit. But nonetheless, all of these questions are going to be, have subjective answers because of that. The commanding officers also tend to set the tone for how a squadron is going to respond to the women in their units. So that also kind of leads to a sort of a flawed methodology because they have a lot of reporting to do. The reporting itself was also very taxing. So this is happening at 6-month intervals. And the initial reporting requirements from participating units were individual job performance summaries, significant incident summaries, peer rating reporting, immediate supervisor rating reporting, immediate subordinate rating reporting, and assistant summaries. So this is coming at a huge cost in terms of what the time that people are required to invest in this trial. DWP Colonel Gay at the time notes that even the reporting itself can be an irritant and could cause prejudice in the trial results. For the women participating, they felt that all of this reporting and all of this attention was actually a form of special treatment, which was exactly what everyone was trying to avoid in this trial. So as I mentioned, the data itself was kind of subjective. The sample size was problematic. An effort to minimize impact in acknowledgement of the limited employment opportunities for women, only a small number of women would participate in the aircrew trial. The goal was to train 20 pilots over 4 or so years, 4 navigators, and 4 flight engineers. The anticipated time frame of these women completing their training and getting to their first and second operational tours meant that very few of them would be on course or on a squadron at the same time. So the problem with that was twofold, as illustrated by Director General Personnel Research and Development, J.E. Mayhood. He says, the small number of women trainees per year precludes the usual statistical analyses. And furthermore, because of these small numbers, it is unlikely that the impact of female participation in the employment setting can be adequately assessed. So Mayhood's assessment here undercuts everything that CAF leadership was hoping to achieve with this trial, including the defensibility of the data, which he states was unlikely to hold up in the face of a hearing. He also indicated that the small numbers were a challenge for the trial participants themselves. His research showed that a minimum of 4 people from a similar minority group was required to forge quote, normal bonds and interactions in a work group, and that the planned number of participants was not enough to, quote, maintain their social viability as a group. So less than 4 women serving together was likely to leave them feeling isolated and without effective coping mechanisms. CF Peru concurred. Still, there were several examples of women throughout the trial who were inexplicably posted to a squadron alone. So the Aircrew trial is actually going along quite well. The first set of trainees begin in November 1979. The first series of reports right up until 1983 indicate that there's really no identifiable problems, certainly no major concerns with these women on their squadrons. By 1983, there are 11 female pilots, 8 navigators, and 3 flight engineers who have completed their training. At 424 Squadron and 436 Squadron, they've reached about 10% of the population. So CF Peru figures that this is an opportunity to kind of do some actual research with a critical mass. So the results are kind of interesting. 424 Squadron, which is search and rescue, they have smaller crews, they're a little bit more tight-knit. Women are feeling generally accepted. The male aircrew that they're interviewing feel that the women have decent flying capabilities, and the CEO is notably very supportive of women in the unit as well. 436 Squadron is completely different. They are perceived as, women are perceived there as being somewhat problematic. And one of the kind of main issues that they were having, there was actually several, but one of the big ones was rumors. So as this piece says, if a guy in the military today gets his wings, he earned them. I think all the guys are proud to wear their wings. I know I am, and I really resent the fact that some of these girls are coming here and they are not capable of flying. They shouldn't be flying. It bothers me that they are wearing the same wings I am and they haven't achieved the same standard a guy has to. So the reason this had come up was because somewhere along the line, a rumor got started that the standards had been lowered for women to participate. And that rumor never really went away. And at 436 Squadron, unfortunately, because the crews were so large, they changed all the time. It was difficult for the women to integrate, to blend in, and for the guys to get to know them. So as a result, they were constantly isolated, they were harassed, they were treated very, very badly at the squadron. The CO was also very unsupportive of having women in the squadron as well, so none of that really helped their cause, despite the fact that there were actually quite a large number of women at the squadron. On the issue of the standards, there have never been any evidence that the standards were lowered. One of the female participants, in replying to this rumor, said, you know, who would do this? Who would lower the standard? That's insane. You still need somebody to be able to fly. You need to be able to get the aircraft where it needs to go, and you need to be able to monitor and fix it if you have to. So it would be in nobody's interest to lower the standards to have people participate. So as we mentioned, leadership kind of an issue. Mickey Colton, who is anyway, Mickey's great, she's so funny, but she was at 436 for quite some time. She ended up, when she retired as a major, over 6,000 hours on Hercs. She is, you know, where Elsie Miguel is Queen of the Hurricanes, Mickey Colton is Queen of the Hercs. And she had this issue with a major where they were out at crew dinner at Bambi's in Germany, and this major sort of out of nowhere threw down his fork and basically said this, you know, you weapon women, how dare you do this, and all this sort of stuff. Anyway, so he did this in front of many, many other crew members. Mickey was very upset, called her, I guess, told her aircraft commander that she was finally going to do something about this. This was several years into the trial. They had dealt with a lot of harassment, a lot of issues at 436, and she was sick of it. So she kind of threw down. It was around 1984, so she had a little bit more clout because being operational, having several years in, they weren't really interested in losing a good pilot at that particular time. So the major did get reprimanded. They asked her what she wanted. She said, I want all of this nonsense to stop. We didn't sleep our way onto these aircraft. We earned our spot, and basically, I want an apology, and I want him to mean it. And of course, At first, he did apologize. He did not mean it. But later, several years later, they were again on another crew dinner in Lar, and it was just the two of them at first. And he did apologize. It was sincere. And anyways, so that sort of healed the rift a little bit. So the final reports, CF Peru releases their final report in November 1985. It's about a month after the trial closes. The Aircrew trial for them was considered a success. Still, only 4 out of 5 squadrons reported achieving acceptance. 436 was still the outlier. Air Command releases its own report shortly after and says that, yes, okay, women served as aircrew and they can do it and whatever, but their performance is still undermined by the restrictions on their employment, which, by the way, is a CAF policy, so they could have, fixed that themselves. Potential conflicts with family obligations, which there were no evidence of during the trial, and even after, again, kind of a policy decision, and pregnancy. And there were very few women who got pregnant during the trial, but this really freaks people out, which is interesting because all of you were born to a woman, presumably. So, we can all make it work, right? So their problem with it is that it's uncontrolled and unexpected. So this is coming from the primary career officer for pilots. So this is considered to be highly disruptive. And so the first woman to get pregnant during the trial, this is 1983, and she was just at the very ground school stage. So they're like, oh, thank God, so many resources were not involved in this woman just, leaving her training. But God forbid, what if she had been, well into her jet training? What if she had been operational? What would we have done? And again, good things to think about before you throw women into the fray, right? But this is very indicative of how the CAF treated this whole situation, where there just were no policies to get women in. And you have to think that it's because they really didn't want them there. We're not going to create policies about pregnancy. We're not going to create policies about maternity leave. We're not going to create policies about family emergencies, harassment, any of these things, because I think at the end of the day, they really didn't think this was going to succeed. So why bother to expend the resources and the time? So their assumptions were, essentially, all women get pregnant. All women will either leave the service or have limited employment flexibility after having children, and that pregnant women cannot serve as aircrew and must be grounded immediately. Within a few years, all of these concerns are kind of mitigated or just proven to not really be a thing. So eventually with pregnancy, a lot of the women who continued to serve after the trial, they would make a decision themselves and with their medical officer as to when was the appropriate time for you to stop flying. Which seems like a very simple answer. Of course, I will say too, there are issues, medical issues that have not fully been explored or dealt with, largely because research dollars did not go to women's health issues, both in the civilian world and the military world. And there are some evidence of higher risk of miscarriage, for example, among female aircrew. So all of those things, that work still needs to be done. So the AirCom report at the end is very interesting because it starts out saying yes, women can do this, the reasons I stated that they can't. But then even within the same report, back to back, trial results indicate that individual women are capable of the same level of effectiveness as is displayed by men in the same occupations. Next line, conclusion. Individual service women display a level of effectiveness lower than that achieved by individual men. It's like, did you not have an editor? You could have given a little bit more space between those things. Sometimes that's hard. So the women themselves were given an opportunity to reflect on their time as well. Captain Leah Mosher, who unfortunately has since passed, was tasked with gathering final thoughts from the women who served at 436 throughout the trial. There were 6 pilots, 5 navigators there. They spoke about lack of information, inconsistent information. So as I mentioned, those trial instructions continually changing. They randomly added loadmasters 3 years into the trial because they heard that 5 of them were already being trained and thought well, we better throw them into the trial too. They were frustrated and concerned about their future employment, so they were thrilled with the idea of being aircrew, not thrilled with the idea of being on trial. They felt that it labeled them as temporary, so it impeded their acceptance by their male colleagues, and that they themselves just didn't know where all this was going to go. Some women, in terms of lack of information, there was one woman who participated in an oral history project that we did at the museum who didn't even realize she was a part of a trial until we put out the call for trial participants, and her friend was like, "Hey, didn't you do this?" And she was like, "Oh, wow, I don't know." And anyway, so it's interesting. And we talked about the no policies, the special treatment, living in a fishbowl, the media attention, Sea of Peru attention. They felt that everybody was watching them all the time, that they couldn't really breathe, they couldn't do their jobs properly. And they did all of that feeling the pressure that they were the ones who were going to pave the way for all the women who may want to be aircrew after them. So if they failed, they not only failed themselves, they failed all of these women coming behind them. They were frustrated with the exclusion from the near combat roles and from combat roles in some cases. And they also felt that marriage and children should not be issues for them if they wanted a career as aircrew. So to close off, they said the kind of the wrap up of the report for the women was, women have done the job, are doing the job, and want to continue doing the job, be it a combat role or not. So they wanted to keep flying. That was basically it. So as a shameless plug for the oral history project that the museum had put together, I have a research project on women in the Canadian Air Force from 1946 to present. This little QR code will take you to this link, and there is a 5-part audio documentary on this winter trials that incorporates archival research, but also some of the oral histories that we had done with the women, so that you can hear what their specific experiences were like. So that's it for me.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so sorry I was unable to make it there in person, but I would like to thank the organizing committee for inviting me to speak and for making this virtual presentation happen. The inscription on one of the headstones in Majigning First Nation Cemetery, which has also been called Rama Reserve Cemetery in Rama, Ontario, reads, "Daughter of Chris and Jane Anderson, gone but not forgotten." By itself, the inscription seems pretty standard, but a closer look reveals some intriguing information that provide an entry point into an underrepresented story in the history of Canada's Second World War. The headstone informs visitors that this grave is one of Canada's official war dead. The presence of the Royal Canadian Air Force badge, along with the size, the shape, and the material of the headstone, indicates that the grave is marked with one of the standard markers supplied by the Commonwealth War Grave Commission. The headstones are used to mark and honor military personnel who died during the World Wars. The above information, combined with the name Alice Lovina Anderson, the rank leading aircraft woman, and the date of death, 14 June 1946, tells us that Anderson died as a result of her service in the Royal Canadian Air Force Women's Division, or RCFWD. She was 22 years old. The location of her grave is also significant. Buried on her family's plot, leading aircraft woman Alice Anderson was a member of the Chippewas of Rama First Nation. Sources suggest that Anderson grew up on the Rama First Nation Reserve, which is, and I quote, located approximately 1.5 hours north of Toronto, Ontario. Her headstone raises several questions. Who was Alice Lovina Anderson? Where did she serve, and how did she die? What does her story add to the rich literature of Canada in the Second World War and the rich history of the Royal Canadian Air Force? Alice Anderson's service and her death provide a way to explore how gender, race, and sacrifice were negotiated during and after the war. She was one of the roughly 44,000 Canadian Second World War dead and one of the 38 Royal Canadian Air Force Women Division personnel who died during or because of the military service. As I've noticed in my previous work, Canadian women military war dead is an understudied topic for numerous reasons. Since women formed a small proportion of the total war dead and were prohibited from serving in combat during the Second World War, scholars typically either ignore or, and I quote, merely state briefly that some women lost their lives because the focus has been on the male combatant. Similarly, as the rich scholarship on commemoration shows, women's role in remembrance has been as mourners, and the male combatant and the grieving mother has historically been the central figures. It is important to note that I'm not meaning to downplay military personnel who died in combat. I recognize their sacrifice, and I recognize also that I'm talking about a small percentage of the total war dead. My previous work provided an overview of the deaths of women who served in the women's services of the Canadian Army, Navy, and Air Force during the war, how their deaths were handled, commemorated, or in many cases forgotten. Stories of women military war dead are increasingly being told in newspapers and online through commemorative websites and posts. Most notably, Anne Gathwick's World War II Canadian Women Project, a website that, and I quote, acts as a memorial to women who died in the Second World War during the service for Canada, end quote, is an incredibly well-researched resource and tells the individual stories of women who died because they served during the Second World War. Gathwick narrates their stories but doesn't analyze them. Building on this previous work, I will start with a discussion of Anderson's lives, her wartime service, and her death before analyzing how her story was and was not a typical story of wartime loss. I argue that Anderson's stories help us broaden the literature on women in war and pushes us to expand our discussions of remembrance and sacrifice. Born on the 28th September 1923 in Remeron, Ontario, Alice Lovina Anderson was the second of 7 children. Her parents, Christopher and Jane Anderson, had 5 daughters, including Alice, and 2 sons. The family lost Morley when he was around 5 years old. Sources suggest that Andersons, like many Canadians, faced their share of struggle. In addition to the loss of Morley, the Great Depression also seems to have made Anderson's family financial situation more difficult. The 1931 census states that the family resided on the reserve, owned their own 3-room house, and that Chris Anderson was employed as a taxi driver with his own car. Then other sources indicate that between then and when Alice enlisted in 1943, he changed jobs about 2 or 3 times. Alice Anderson listed her father's employment as a guard in Pickering when she enlisted in 1943. According to a letter her mother wrote to the RCAF Maintenance Command at Uplands in July 1946, the family moved around a lot during the 1940s. Other sources confirm that it was tough to make ends meet on Rama First Nation Reserve. The land was poor for farming, and so many families found it pretty tough. Anderson attended Uxbridge Public School in Uxbridge, Ontario from 1930 to 1938 or 9, depending on the source, when she finished grade 8. In September 1941, Anderson left Toronto, where she began working as a domestic servant. And from March to April 1942, she attended a business course at Shaw's Roseland in Toronto. For some unknown reasons, she never completed the course. It's possible that Anderson was able to balance her job with her school, or perhaps her family duties called her back home. She left the course in April and quit her job in June of 1942 to go back home, and I quote, to look after mother. Anderson remained at home for roughly 5 months and moved to Nobel, Ontario in October 1942 for work as a waitress at the Ladies' Staff House. She worked there for roughly 4 months before she enlisted in the RCFWD on the 22nd of January 1943. Anderson's employment history conformed to the gender and racialized labor market of the time. As scholars note, Indigenous women and other women of color have a long history of being disproportionately employed in the lower paying, lower status service sector. Gendered and racialized power relations similarly shaped Anderson's choice of trade. She indicated that she wished to serve in general duties or as a hospital assistant on her attestation paper. The recruiting staff in North Bay illustrate the gender and racialized attitudes of the time when they positively assessed Anderson, and I quote, neat, attractive Indian girl, bright, enjoys working as a waitress, creates favorable impressions, end quote, and concluded that she was, end quote, found suitable for standard general duties. As Mary Ziegler explains in their history of the RCFWD, general duties included, and I quote, all the people who were necessary for carrying out of domestic and cleaning chores and for work as messengers and runners, end quote. Ziegler also writes that general duties was not the most popular trade, and Airwomen assigned to that one often tried to switch to a different trade. The use of the word girl in the assessment also reinforces power relations. Historians have shown that in 1940s, and I quote, the word girl was not restricted to individuals of a specific age in colloquial speech, but was applied according to status. So girls included Indigenous women and other women of color, teens, unmarried women, women who worked in factories, women who worked in offices. These all were all quote unquote girls. The emphasis on her looks and appearance also speak to gender norms. By 1943, the Royal Canadian Air Force, WD, and the women's services of the Army, Navy, and Air Force faced what historian Ruth Pearson has called the Whispering Campaign. So the Whispering campaign, which saw widespread rumors that servicewomen were sexually loose, sexually immoral, was a reaction to how the formation of the women's services in 1941 and 1942 challenged gender norms that labeled military service as masculine. These gender norms were built on a binary that men were the ones who were supposed to go off to war and protect the women who remained in supportive non-military roles on the home front. Prior to the Second World War, women had served as military nurses, and the Second World War saw those roles expand to other support roles in the armed forces, such as clerks, cooks, equipment assistants, drivers, and other general duties. Canadians also worried about the masculine effects of military service on women. So they worried that the institution that was known to turn boys into men would do the same to women. To address these concerns, the federal government and senior military officials stressed that servicewomen would be kept safe, remain feminine, and would serve in non-combat roles that aligned with stereotypical feminine duties far away from the front lines. As the assessment of Anderson demonstrates, recruitment staff carefully selected women who presented as a neat and attractive manner to protect the reputation of the RCFWD. Anderson underwent basic training at No. 7 Manny Depot in Rockcliffe. Following that, she served in numerous places in Ontario, such as No. 3 Flying Instructor School in Empire, Air Force Headquarters in Ottawa, and by March 1945, she was at RCF Station Uplands. Her precise duty varied, and I quote, "She had been a timekeeper in flights, worked in the canteen, and did clerical work as part of her duties," end quote. Grace Poulin documents that Indigenous women reported a variety of experiences during the Second World War. Some recalled that they found acceptance and were treated the same as non-Indigenous women while in uniform. Others reported experiencing gender discrimination, and some recalled racial discrimination, especially when the time came to accessing their post-war benefits. Since I have not found anything that Anderson wrote about her time in uniform, it is unclear whether she experienced discrimination, acceptance, or a mix of both. Based on her service file, it seems as if she would fit in and was well suited for Air Force life. Anderson enjoyed being physically active. She indicated that she swam a lot and enjoyed tennis, bowling, dancing, and skating on her attestation paper. Ziegler and other servicewomen's account illustrates that Airwomen joined a range of sports, were often able to go swimming, and that dancing was a popular pastime. In a December 1944 memorandum, it was a report that Anderson had a very good character, was superior in her trade abilities, and I quote, "would make a very good general clerk upon discharge." So she seems to have been really good at her job and was assessed very favorably in all her assessments. Anderson's health started deteriorating around March 1945, and she was treated for gallbladders in September 1945. In November, she was admitted to hospital and was soon diagnosed with tuberculosis. She was discharged in December 1945 from the RCF as medically unfit and transferred under the Department of Veterans Care to the Essex County Sanatorium, which is near Windsor, Ontario. She died on the 14th of June, 1946. Correspondence between Jane Anderson and defense officials remind us, as scholars note, and I quote, "military deaths are both public and private losses. Like other grieving relatives, Jane Anderson wanted public recognition of her loss and her daughter's sacrifice. She wrote to the RCF Estate Branch on 18th October 1946 and requested, and I quote, "Another thing I wanted to ask was a headstone for her grave. There are several at the Cemetery of Veterans who died recently. I would very much like one for her grave," end quote. Mrs. Anderson's request was granted. Anderson's file also demonstrates the frustration that grieving relatives felt as they dealt with the bureaucracy that handled the administration of military personnel's estate. Mrs. Anderson sent multiple letters between July and 1946, attempting to get different aspects of her daughter's estate, such as her war gratuities money, pension, clothes, personal effects, and warband. A complication in her leading Aircraftwomen's case, Erin Anderson's case, was that she had opened a joint bank account with a Mrs. Sunny Dunmore who lived in the U.S. While Mrs. Anderson claimed that Mrs. Dunmore was, and I quote, "of no relation," Anderson's service record lists Mrs. Dunmore as her aunt and one of her next of kin, along with her mother and sometimes her father. On the advice of the Estates Branch, Mr. Anderson even consulted a lawyer who gave her much the same advice as the Estates Branch, that she was out of luck because the joint account was in the U.S. and there was not much that could be done. Mrs. Anderson's grief and frustration emerged clearly in a letter dated 18th October 1946. She wrote, and I quote, Alice never said anything about giving her anything, but may have told her to take care of them till she got better. I never got anything while she was in the Air Force, but she always said she would give us something when she got discharged. We're of a distance of over 400 miles from Essex Sanatorium, and we're not in a position to visit her as often as we should have. Even after they told us she wasn't going to live, I did not have the courage to ask her to bring all her clothes home, owing that I did not want to worry her. Anyway, there were over 300 worth of clothes and personal effects missing, but I guess I'll have to let everything go, being that there isn't anything that can be done. Alice had only met this Mrs. Dunmore a couple of years ago. We raised Alice ourselves till she was 18, and I really think Mrs. Dunmore doesn't deserve to get all the things she got." End quote. The reasons why Anderson opened the account and named Mrs. Dunmore as one of her next of kin will remain unknown. Since Anderson chose family over work twice, once when she was a domestic service and once when she had complied for a compassionate discharge because her father was ill, it does suggest that she was close to her family. Mrs. Anderson's letter hints about a possible generation class over money. Poulin discovered that many Indigenous servicewomen recalled that it was expected that they send part of their pay home to help with family expenses. It is also entirely possible that Mrs. Anderson focused on obtaining her daughter's estate as a way of dealing with her grief. In any case, Mrs. Anderson's letter raises the question of whose loss deserves greater recognition. Scholars have documented that certain losses have been afforded more public recognition. Mrs. Anderson, like other grieving mothers and wives, received the Memorial Cross, also known as the Silver Cross for her loss, but male relatives did not receive this honor until 1976. Leading aircraft Alice Lovina Anderson's service and death was in many ways representative of other Air Force women who died because of their service, and in other ways highly unusual. Like other Air Force women, Anderson served in a support role on Canadian soil. In addition, like her fellow Air Force women, her service and death challenged wartime gender norms that women would be kept safe and would support the war in traditionally feminine ways. Her military service, like that of other female workers, servicemen, military nurses, placed her in greater danger than if she had not served. The Canadian Pension Commission ruled that military service contributed to Anderson's death, which was not the case in all of servicewomen's death. Tuberculosis was also among the leading causes of servicewomen's and civilian women's death in 1940s. Air Force women also died in plane and other crashes. Historians have shown that accidents and illness have took the lives of many Canadian military personnel of all genders during the Second World War. One of the main differences is that Anderson, like other RCFWD personnel, was not killed by enemy fire, and they died in much smaller numbers than Air Force men. In addition, to date, leading aircraftwoman Anderson was the only Indigenous member of the RCFWD that I found who is counted among Canada's official war dead. Poulin documents that Indigenous servicewomen have been often hidden and that it's unclear just how many served during the Second World War. Like other military personnel of all genders, Anderson's death has been honored by being included in the official Second World Book of Remembrance and with the Canadian Commonwealth War Graves Commission headstone. While Anderson's parents chose Gone But Not Forgotten, her story is not one we commonly hear. Studying Anderson's life, military service, and her death allows us to see how gender and racialized power relations shaped her time in uniform and brought her understandings of what it meant to be a uniformed woman during the war. It also helps personalize the roughly 44,000 Canadians who gave their lives in service of Canada during the Second World War and pushes us to broaden our discussions of remembrance. Thank you.
Questions?
This is a question, I think, for all three members of the panel. You're all looking at historical issues, things that really occurred 30 or 40 or 50 years ago or longer. How do you think we have changed, if at all, in terms of the issues that concern you? In other words, has there been an improvement for the position of women in the Canadian forces of the RCAF? What do these historical events tell us about the society that we're dealing with, as well as the institution that we were dealing with?
That the Queen Mary is really hard to turn. I think in some ways it's. I mean, obviously it's not that simple, but I think a lot of the literature that examines women's position in the military, and it doesn't have to be the Canadian military, but just really militaries writ large, the concept of the warrior is male. It's a masculine environment. So it's really difficult to break into something that for, centuries or millennia has been an exclusively masculine space. So women, I think, in the forces, for a long time, and certainly I think everyone here can speak to this, but treated as an auxiliary force, called upon when necessary, put away when not, and really just, I guess, this idea that you don't get to choose what you do, we'll choose what you do, and then you fill this role, and then we will choose when you leave, and all that sort of stuff. So in that way, I think things have changed because women, all these occupations are open, whether they are particularly welcome. I mean, I think you can see from the way the dominoes have fallen in the last few years, in the Canadian forces, in the Australian forces, and the British, and all that, with all of these scandals for sexual harassment and things like that. Things aren't entirely different. I feel like they're better. So there's that, I think, the conversation between integration and inclusion. So where do women are integrated, but I don't know if we've achieved full inclusion to date, but I think the march is going on to that, that side of things.
Thank you. Yes, I think I could talk for a while about this one. I think the first thing that I would say is not so much prior to unification, but since unification, it was never a question of whether women would serve, but it was how they would serve. And in fact, going the 70s and 80s, they needed women. They really did need women because the recruits just weren't coming to the door. And I think it was mentioned earlier presentation what was going on in that period of time. There was a lot of peace activism, anti-war movement, that sort of thing. Men didn't want to join the Canadian military, right? So I think what we've learned is you can't forget about 50% of the population. The other comment that I would make, it's one of the slides I had to take out. If we don't document this history of how this integration of women unfolded and developed within the organization, someone else is going to tell the story and we're going to forget what we learned. I guess historians talk about that, but I specifically think of 1989, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, 10 years to fully integrate women into all environments and roles. The military is monitored over that period by the Canadian Human Rights Commission. There's a Ministers Monitoring Board. 1999, the Human Rights Commission writes a letter to the Chief of Defence Staff and says, you did not fully integrate women into all environments and roles. However, we have enough confidence in the leadership of the military to believe that they will continue with the effort and make it happen. I was on the air staff when I was preparing the Air Force for the report to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, and many of you will know General Kinsman. So General Kinsman would have me in his office and he'd say, Karen, we know that you're doing a good job in making the Air Force look really good, so the tribunal will think we've got it. He said, we really haven't changed the culture of this organization. How do we do that? And we would have discussions about that. So by 1999, many believed the job was finished. And so then you started to hear, like if I would mention gender at a research presentation, I'd say, do you have that analysis by male, female or something? People would say to me, really, do we still need to talk about this? We're a gender neutral organization. Gender integration is fait accompli, we did that, right? So people who are joining in 1999, and I went to Australia on a team when Australia was bringing women into the combat arms, and we were there to help share what we did wrong, to help the Australians bring women into combat in 2013. We had an infantry officer joined in 1999, and now CDS General Carignan was our colonel head of the mission when we went on that trip to Australia. That young captain had no idea that there was a time in which the military didn't want women in infantry. When she joined, she just thought that's the way it always was. So when she was experiencing difficulties, she's like, what's going on, right? So she was kind of refighting the old fights because the history was gone, it had been retold, right? So I think long story for, we really need to keep on top of this because, you know, some of us have said in different discussions, we cannot take this progress for granted. It could be taken away from us, right? So, yeah, so I think that's why the history is so important.
Sarah,
yeah,
do you want to
I
comment?
don't have too much to add to what the other panelists said. I would point out that when Nicola Goddard died in combat, like it made major headline news. So women are in combat role, but you see a lot of the similar sort of discussions as you see in the 1940s of this as sort of breaking gender stereotypes and sort of the uproar. I mean, we heard about her death. Her story made the news in the way that the women I'm talking about don't. But increasingly we are hearing the stories of women in the Second World War. So in lead up to Remembrance Day, you get stories of airwomen who died in crashes. So more and more we're hearing about it. But I think there, as all the other panelists have said, there's much more work that remains to be done.
Thank you. Rob?
Thank you for 3 excellent presentations. And I'd like to pick up on a point that Karen just made about having to stay on top and go back to one of the points you raised about the concern of the forces in trying to position itself against the inclusion of women. You included that list of what were the arguments before the committee. And if nothing, to bring forward just how relevant your last point was about staying cognitive of this, is of course the point about the concern that the CF had about military allies. We know that Trump has appointed and will try to get confirmed a Secretary of Defense that is already openly talking about the removal of women from combat roles. Assuming, of course, that this individual is actually going to be confirmed and assuming that he does what he says he's going to be doing, what are some of the impacts that it's going to be having on the Canadian forces if, in fact, we have the United States moving towards a position of rolling back, taking out women? I don't know what it will, my crystal ball is as good as yours right now, but what does that mean for the Canadian forces if, in fact, we see a United States that moves to, in fact, reduce the role of women in the forces?
I think I can answer that. I think we just mentioned inclusion, right? So we definitely aren't there yet. We can't take our progress for granted, although I think it's very significant. And we do have our first female CDS. However, there's still rumblings out there about whether women should really be in combat units. They're definitely not 100% accepted. I think they're much more largely accepted than they were. But there's still people serving who would like to see this whole policy go back. So I think as the world around us changes, Canada, I think, can be a leader in this regard, although it's a big fight. But I look, for example, at Major Sue Forge, the slides I couldn't spend much time on. She deployed with the RAF because they were bringing their first young lieutenant as a pilot into their helicopter squadrons, and they wanted an experienced woman to be there for her. They weren't on the same crew, but she was an international leader. And I think when we went to Australia, we demonstrated international leadership in that regard. I will never forget, and I know she's our CDS right now, but I'll never forget being in, it's on the north part of Australia where they deploy. It's kind of the pointy end of their operations. It was the last of 2 weeks of 19 presentations, starting in Canberra and headquarters, where you're generally accepting the message, and the further you got into the operations, the more of the challenge. So we're in this unit. It's a combat arms unit, and it was Q&A time. And Colonel Carignan was managing the Q&A for our team, and a colonel, infantry officer from Australia said, yes, right, well, your story's really nice, but what's going to happen when Canada really goes into combat? And we're talking about a colonel who had just spent months and months leading teams in Afghanistan. I think I mean, she had incredible combat exposure and experience. So she leaned over, and she, you know, she tends to lean over when she's really going to speak into something. And the colonel in Australia said, right, yes, okay, thank you, let's thank our Canadian friends. And so that was it, we were cut off because there was gonna, but so I think what I'm saying is our leadership has to be strong in terms of being an international example, I think, on these things. And also there's other countries I think are similar to us that we need to really keep in touch with. But yeah, I don't think we could take it for granted.
I think as of the point I made about the Queen Mary being really difficult to turn, maybe it's only really difficult to turn one way. I feel like going the other way, it would go much faster. To Karen's point, I think it is really important to hold on to that because the gains are hard won, but can be very quickly removed, as we've seen in U.S. Situations to date.
Adam?
My question specifically for Erin, but any of the other panelists can weigh in as well. I'm curious about is there a partisan conflict to the SWINTER trials particularly, or more generally, does partisan politics come into women's integration into the Canadian forces in a way that we see, and the example of the possible Secretary of Defense in the US, that the composition and a lot of those culture wars issues become very much subject of the American military. Have we seen that in Canada? I'm not aware, so I'd be curious if there's examples of that.
That's a good question. I was really looking at it more from just what, I mean, I guess if you look at like politically, it was because of everything that was going on with the Human Rights Act and then later the Charter and all of that sort of stuff, like that does push the military to do things that it wouldn't want to do. So I think, yeah, the political aspect, maybe Karen could speak to the, conservatives versus liberals if that had a bearing on it. But I think at least once the trial got going, it was really, the desire was to come up with these, bona fide operational requirements that would say, we don't have to follow this the Human Rights Act. Basically, we have this exception. So I don't know. Do you think there was a political aspect to?
I mean, definitely because of the relationship between military and society, there has to be, a political relationship. And so, I think back to the Parliamentary Committee on Equality. It was certainly a conservative government, and it was a multi-party report that first came out on equality for all, but the final report toward equality, which was the government report, said, no, you aren't going to monitor the Canadian forces on this. We're going to let them do it themselves because they know their business the best. Fast forward to the Crew trials, Liberal government, Parambidi, and I haven't studied this enough to be any kind of authority, but I'm starting to feel these things come out as I look more and more at it. So what I didn't mention today, the Crew trials, combat-related employment of women was about integrating, it was a trial, and the Army in particular, the first DG Crew, they were making it very clear that failure was an option. This was a trial because we have to be honest with the Canadian public. If it's not going to work, we're not going to do it. And then there's back memos coming from the minister and through Parambidi's staff saying, he was wording it as if it was an exercise in integration, which is what later the Canadian Human Rights Trial would tell them to do, which was under a Liberal government. But then the military, there were these memos going back and forth saying, wait a minute, what is this? This isn't an integration exercise, this is a trial. So I think the government was trying to influence how the military was thinking about the combat-related employment of women, not to see it as a trial, but to see it as movement. And then, of course, the Human Rights Tribunal said it'll cease to be trials, and the resources will continue to support the full integration of women. So there's, I mean, you can't avoid the political connection. And the other one I would say was with the lifting of the 1992, when they lifted the policy prohibiting the participation of 2S LGBTQ plus persons in the military. That one, interestingly enough, the military was ready to give that up earlier than the government allowed them, but now there was government concern that if they changed the policy, it would impact the upcoming election. And that was a Conservative government that wanted them to hold off on the policy till after the election, right? So definitely it gets in there.
And I think even on the women's side as well, a lot of the news around the trial and everything is there's a reliance on public perception as well. So there were a lot of kind of studies done and surveys done about like what does the Canadian public think about women in combat or in near combat roles and stuff. So I think if those had gone a different way, which it showed that most Canadians were kind of accepting of this move, even in 1978, if that had gone a different way, then maybe the politics around it would have gone a different way as well.
Hi, yeah, my name is Matt. A question for the panel. Now we see Canada is still struggling to meet recruitment numbers, and although things have improved for women, new stories that come out even last year make it seem like it's still not a great place to be. What would you like to see going forward to bring recruitment numbers, especially with women, up?
Well, I think what they're doing now, there's a couple things. So they're looking at targeting like specific recruitment efforts to attract women into the forces. So that's sort of a new approach. I think one of the biggest things that they're going to have to do sort of relates back to what Alan English was talking about earlier today, which is that you need to make the forces attractive to people who want to have families, they want to have career advancement, they would really like not to be sexually harassed at work, I would venture to say. So that kind of culture change needs to become evident as well. And I think also just relaying the kinds of work that you can do, because I think a lot of people look at the forces and they see very specific jobs, but there are so many jobs and so many ways to serve that I don't think they do a great job of sharing with the public. For example, if you don't like to move, you can serve and work full-time in the reserves, and you're not required to move to different postings and things like that. So I think making things like that clear, that there are a bunch of different ways to serve in a bunch of different capacities, I think for women would be appealing. Certainly sorting out some of the culture issues. And then one of the other things that they're doing with fighter pilots in particular, because there have only been 7 female fighter pilots since that occupation opened to them in 87. That was when D started, right? 87. And so people ask all the time, like, why aren't there more female fighter pilots? And there's never really been a concerted effort to really mine that question. And so that, at least according to the commander, is something that they're beginning to look at as well. So how can they even attract women into these, super visible positions? Work in progress.
The other one that there's been quite a bit of talk about in the policy or the social science community with the external people being funded through the Mobilizing Insights and National Defense and Security, for example. So we're getting really good, strong, critical perspectives on what's happening in defense. And moving forward, we were talking about cyber warriors earlier and sitting in a dark room and, the young people who don't want to be out there running 10 kilometers with a pack on their back sort of thing. So universality of service. It's a really hard, talk about, shifting the ship. The military is so tied to universality of service, but how many Canadians with the minds that we need is that excluding? And do we really need everyone 100% same level of universality of service, for example? And there's been some stuff written about that in the Canadian Military Journal and that sort of thing. The other thing I would comment in terms of the stuff around sexual misconduct, it's not a great place to be. The bit of research that has been done, some public polling contracts that Defense has done and that sort of thing, it doesn't seem to be having that big of an impact on young people, right? So I remember when I joined, and I'm sure there's other women, I knew nothing, there was no internet or anything, I knew nothing. But people, as soon as there was people found out I was interested, people started telling me that bad things were gonna happen to me if I join the military, and they're going to talk about you, they're going to call you those nasty, names, because women in the military are known to be, whores, lesbians, all those sorts of things, right? I didn't care. I was young. So somehow I think we have to appeal still to the sense of adventure, but also look at the cohort of young Canadians differently than we did back when I joined, for sure. Yeah.
I will say I had the opposite experience because I wanted to serve in the Navy. My grandfather was a Navy man. His story seemed fun. And when I told him that, his response was, under no circumstances will you do that. You have no idea what they do to the women on those ships. So I said, okay.
Speaking to what Sarah was talking about, an Indigenous woman who served. And I think, we talk about the colonial structure of the military. And so I think there's a lot of really hard thinking that has to be done around that too, to make sure that it's more welcoming to a broader range of people, for sure. We're still a very white-centric organization.
Okay, thank you very much. Just one comment to end, which was in the UK, funnily enough, the integration of women was driven by a Tory government, and their driver was the lack of men joining the service. That was precise, and the services were still resistant, but the Tory minister said, well, you're not recruiting enough people. You're going to run out of people. You're going to have to do this, so do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly that. Well, fantastic panel. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you, first of all, for keeping so well to time. Thank you for an excellent discussion, excellent papers, all round great success. Thank you all.
Thank you.